intro?
Sure. Assume you can hear me. Yeah, I'm Neil Giarratana. We'll do an intro in the presentation. So I've been at Asurion a little under 2 years, software engineer for a lot more years than that. And just have a good bit of fun with what we're doing. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started if we're good, Will.
Yeah, please take it away.
Awesome.
And again, if you're just now joining us, if you have any questions as we go, feel free to drop them in the chat, and I'll try to ping Neil as we go. And obviously, we'll have some Q&A time towards the end as well. So thanks.
Sounds good. Thanks. Yeah, so title of the presentation, Microfrontends, Seamless Experiences and Autonomous Teams. Again, Neil Giarratana with Asurion, a little under 2 years. Basically, we have what we call the One Service platform team. So One Service is our micro front end platform. So if you want to reach me, you can get me on Twitter at Neil's Mind, on GitHub, Neil's Mind. And then from there, you can get links like LinkedIn or anything else that you want to reach out to me on. And so, just super brief, if you're not familiar with Asurion, what we do, all-in-one solution for all things tech. We provide live support in just a tap, click, call, or visit away, and help customers to protect, connect, and enjoy all their technology. So basically, we help you to use your tech, whether it's your mobile phone or your home devices, et cetera. And that'll sort of weave through a little bit through the presentation to help you understand sort of where we're coming from. So we'll start with, sort of where we all started a number of years back. Way back, we had this sort of concept of, we had monolithic systems. So, if you think back to your Ruby on Rails days and your J2EE server days, like we would have application server or servers that would embed the UI inside. All of the APIs would all be sort of in this big ball of mud that was code. And at some point along the line, we decided, well, that's really hard to work as teams. And so as those teams, we decided it'd be a really good idea to sort of break those apart. And so we created microservices. And so the microservices are great. It starts to lead us down this path where we can start to develop independently, right? And so in this case, you look here and you see like the device protection team or the tech expert team or the profile team. They're all able, in theory, to build and deploy on their own. And that's cool because it decouples us from one another and it separates based on domains. The issue was that model is really still tied together with a monolithic UI, right? And so all of a sudden we changed from, we're going to have, and I'm just using the example of Rails because it's easy. We're going to have Rails server, and I should say I really enjoyed Rails, but we're going to have Rails servers. Before, well, now we're going to have these API servers, but we need something to serve the UI. So all of a sudden, we ended up building our application twice, right? Like we built it as microservices in the back end, and then we have this monolithic UI in the front end, and it's still really painful because in order for the tech experts to release in this model, they better be sure that the device protection team is also getting their code and merging it in together, and we all become bound in terms of our pipelines. And so that's kind of a challenging model. It actually doesn't quite achieve these autonomous teams that we're seeking. So really good on seamless experience for our users, really kind of bad for our developers in terms of tied together development cycles. And so the other model that you could see is, well, okay, let's take and let's separate out the applications. And you actually saw this at Asurion. We sort of had all of these different customer experiences at different domains so that the different teams could build independently, they could iterate really quickly, they could work together or work separately in their cycles. But the seamless experience thing sort of disappears, and you start to feel like, I'm working with this single company, but I seem to be driving all over town to go to all their different offices. Like we really wanted to feel like one company, one experience, one seamless experience for our customers. So in this case, great for teams, not great for seamless experience. And the other issue with it, as we grew as Asurion, was it wasn't just 3. Like the further we went, the more experiences we kept adding on. And all of them end up with all of these independent, you end up building everything twice. We've got to do analytics separately, and we've got to do monitoring separately. And we're going to have our design system. Well, we could have shared libraries, but now every time we make a change, I've got to import more modules across. And so none of this felt good. It's not good for our customers. It really doesn't scale very well. And so our goal when we came in to look at this was this sort of concept of we wanted a seamless user experience, but we didn't want to do that at the expense of the teams that we have. And we have teams all over the world, a huge population in Nashville. We also have teams Tel Aviv, in the DC area, really spread all over. And we really didn't want to make it where all of a sudden, oh, this is great, let's over bias towards seamless user experience. Let's do a mono repo and put everybody into a single application, single repo, and let's move on. We really wanted to keep it separate. And so, the first thing I'll sort of lead with is, what is a micro front end? You hear this term, it's kind of a buzzword that's going right now. And according to Cam Jackson at ThoughtWorks, in a really great article, it's an architectural style where independently deliverable front-end applications are composed into a greater whole. So keywords there: independently deliverable front-end composed into a greater whole, right? So we can compose them. And that composition thing, I think, is pretty key. And so in simple terms, you can think of micro front end as loosely equivalent to microservices for UI. It's these separate things that can be composed together, but it's actually composed in the browser. Within this presentation, you'll hear me talk a bit and use interchangeably the term micro experience and micro front end. And I don't know, the reason I say micro experience all the time, and I actually don't, is I end up talking about this a lot. And saying micro front end all day is really, really wordy. Saying micro experience is just as wordy, but I never quite felt right about, it didn't sort of roll off the tongue to say MF. MX actually kind of feels a little better. And the truth is even aside from that in the abbreviation, it actually brings together our design teams so that they can get on board with this as well, because this isn't, micro front end is a very sort of technical term. It's very much about our JavaScript front end, our React front end, our single page app. It's front end versus back end. A micro experience is, well, wait a minute, let me think about this in a bigger scope with product and with design to say, well, could we compartmentalize experiences and almost think of them as a micro app, a micro experience? And then all of a sudden, the design teams sort of light up and they get involved and product gets involved. And now we're not thinking just about the geekery of how we piece this all together. We're actually thinking about real experiences for our customers that we then compose into seamless flows, seamless experiences that are all composed of smaller experiences. So from here forward, you probably hear me say MX or micro experience, but I just want you to know that those are, basically equivalent. If anything, micro experience is overloaded with, design concept or product concept. And so I said I wouldn't say micro front ends anymore, but here we go. Micro front end approaches, there's really 3 approaches. And we looked at all 3. There's really live together, build together, and run together. So live together really means all our code lives in a single mono repo rather. It's built together and it's deployed together. So from a seamless experience point of view, it has all the benefits of like all the codes together. If you really want to run end-to-end tests over the entire application, this is a really good way to go. And there's some great examples of sort of mono repo approaches. Build together is, okay, I'm going to keep my repos separate, but what I'm going to do is take and basically put together code modules that are composed at build time into a single deployment. And so in this case, all the code, all of the modules, et cetera, are all hosted together. They're all built together in a single pipeline, but they're in separate repos along the way. And then run together is, I have autonomous teams that deploy individual modules that are composed actually in the browser itself. And of those 3 models, we went with option 3, run together, for a number of really good reasons, which I'll lay out. It's not that any one of these is good or bad. I think for me, I would probably go one direction or the other, either live together or run together. The build together sort of has the worst of both worlds, in the sense of live together. I have everything in one place. I can get my arms around it and I feel good about that. It has the negative of you've got one build pipeline, and the one build pipeline, if we have 50 teams and one team stuff is breaking the build, all of us are trying to figure out how to, sort of solve that problem. Run together allows every team to build and deploy independently. And so that's the positive, but you can't, the end-to-end testing gets a little bit harder. The build together has all the worst of that, where my pipeline itself gets plugged up with everything that's going on. My end-to-end tests are kind of hard because I have all these inner working pieces that I have to assemble for end-to-end. So like I said, run together or live together, I think, is where I would land, but your results may vary. So in the case, getting back to sort of that story of, we want our customers to think of us as a single experience. From our customers' point of view, we really want it to look like one single thing that they're hitting, which is my.asurion.com. And so under the covers, what you end up with is this thing, and we'll talk a little bit about how this is architected, but in our MX framework, effectively, you can think of the top part, the geekery in the top, is the app root. It's the root of the application that does the composition. It's where the index HTML lives. It also has, and you can see those gray boxes down the right side, React and theming and authentication. Those are shared utility modules that we mount in the root app and make available using an import map. And then down below are all of the MXs. And so each MX, dashboard, claims, tech advisor, and so on, you can think of as their own independent applications that are single page apps that can be mounted by the root app. So we'll pause there for just a sec. So what do we sort of mean there? In a single page or in a micro front end, and I'll talk in a sec about single spot. In a micro front end application, each one of these apps underneath could actually exist on its own. And for us at Asurion, they actually did exist on their own. So they might have had separate domains or been subdirectories of other domains. But what we have is, dashboard is a React app, claims is a React app, tech advisor is a React app, all separate. In theory, they could actually, 3 of them could be React, and one of them could be Vue.js, and another one could be Angular. As we go through this, it's not recommended. And I can tell you for us, at Asurion, we're kind of a React shop. Everything we do tends to be in React in order to be consistent. The benefit of this, of being able to allow us to have multiple apps that are sort of separate in one architecture is, well, what happens when someday, and who knows how long, React isn't the thing for us? How do we start to create an opportunity for us to innovate and change and experiment without having to wipe the whole thing? Like, how could we first test and learn and then strangle off anything we want to migrate away from or choose to live in this sort of heterogeneous world? So again, root app, lightweight JavaScript, super lightweight. MXs, really single page apps. The only thing that they really give up in this case, I shouldn't say the only thing, but the major thing that they give up here is they basically surrender their index.html to the root app. The root app is going to decide how we route from one MX to the next. So you see it has default and /protection and /advisor. Depending on which route the customer is going, will determine which MX, which JavaScript bundle gets loaded and which user experience gets loaded within. And so if you take that a step further, By doing it that way, we have the root app. The root app is managed by a platform team, and we take care of all of these pieces. We create the utility modules. We manage the root app. We use an import map JSON to define all of the MXs. We have our own build pipeline and our own repo. Now, any of the teams that want to get bound into this structure, they can submit a PR. We review it, we make sure it's all going to mount in, and now they're off and running. Now, all that they're modifying is this import map when they do that. For the MXs, so for within these micro experiences, let's say the claims team here, they have their own repository completely separate. They have their own build process. And in this case, what this is doing is behind the scenes, and these aren't real domains, but behind the scenes, what ends up happening is the root app will take and proxy the packages to be able to compose in the front end in the browser. Ordinarily, I'd say, are there any questions? But we're going to go on. If you have questions, go ahead and pop them up as we go. Hopefully that's clear. So in order to achieve this within the system, hopefully I didn't double click there, we leverage an open source framework called Single SPA. And I can't say enough about this project. We actually went through, I don't know, 8 or 10 different open source frameworks. We didn't create it. I believe it's Joel Denning. Hopefully I'm saying that right, and I may not be, and I will follow up, or maybe Will, you can look it up in case I got it wrong, because he and team deserve all credit. The Single SPA framework is fantastic. And it really made it easy. So this is an open source framework that takes care of, when we show all this stuff on the previous screen, all of the things like mounting and unmounting, defining the API, the routing between, all of that is defined within Single SPA itself. They also have a lot of really nice sort of helper libraries within for things like, oh, I have a React app. Can I basically sort of convert the lifecycle methods of Single SPA and make them apply to React? And can you make it simple for the app.js or index.js or whatever you might use? Can I make it simple for that to just mount into Single SPA? So within Single SPA, there's basically 4 types of framework components. There's a root config. And so if you think of that thing that was up in the top, that app root thing that we were talking about, you have the root config. That's what that is. And it renders the HTML page. So it owns the index HTML and the JavaScript that registers applications. The root config exists only to start up the Single SPA applications. And I'll tell you, just as as we've gone on and on through this project. So we started this project late last year. And as we've been continually progressing, and onboarding more and more of these MXs into production, one of the things that we keep sort of fighting back on continually is to keep the root app as thin as humanly possible. So as soon as you get like this root thing, everybody wants like shared state, and everybody wants like, well, why don't we just mount this into the root app? Things like, whether it's native React libraries, or it's analytics packages, or it's style libraries, all kinds of things. And our perspective is, look, we're going to allow you to mount in these sort of shared libraries as you go. If you're an MX, so if you don't need our analytics package, then don't use it. Use your own analytics package for your MX. But if you need it, it's there. And so we try to keep the root config itself super thin. Second is applications. And so these are, if you look again back at the thing that we have, like / protection, right? Opens the claims kind of thing, or Tech Advisor or otherwise. And so applications are basically single page applications packaged up into modules. Each application must know how to bootstrap, mount, and unmount itself from the DOM. And so there's a specific API that you find within Single SPA that you would make use of in this case, so that, basically you follow the format so that you can be used as a Single SPA application. The third is parcels. And so if the applications are, I own a specific route, I own / protection, I'm an MX for claims. A parcel is, think of it like a widget. It's a thing. So some screens, right? Let's say my home page, if you will, my main dashboard page, I might have multiple different units that I want to include into that page. And so those units, wouldn't it be great? So I'll give you an example. In our dashboard, we want to show, show you the devices that you have registered with your plan. And we want to show you maybe an article to suggest to you, et cetera. Well, there's a devices team, and the devices team, wouldn't it be great if they could build the parcel, the widget that goes on the dashboard to show you your devices, because they know the most about it. And maybe a different team that's responsible for articles could do the articles widget or parcel within that dashboard. That's part of what you get with single spas. You have these parcels that are sort of composable widgets that don't have their own path. They have on a single page, you compose multiple. Take a breath. Oh, there's a great question, actually, that Will popped in here, which is any experience with Webpack module federation and the pros, cons of it versus single spa. So the experience is limited with Webpack module federation. When we were going through this process, it was still earlier days for it at the time. I don't think they're mutually exclusive from one another, and that's actually something that's on our backlog, is to do an exploration of sort of combined Webpack module federation and single spot together. And who knows, we may, at some point in the future, take and transition to the Webpack module federation. For us, I think what we liked about single spa was we didn't have to be all in on any particular thing. And what I mean by that is, in order to get this going, so let's say that, I don't know, let's say that we had 20 applications, 20 different applications that we were going to try to bring in. We were able to onboard those applications usually into non-prod, like just to get them functioning within a couple days, like a day to a couple days. And actually Will did a tremendous job on a helper library that helps with Create React app to help us get sort of a shared configuration that made it dead simple for our developers, where we didn't have to modify a whole lot about what we were doing within the libraries themselves or within the way that we bundled and deployed. Basically, what we would do is have one Webpack configuration that was for the standalone app, right? So, for example, photos, if you have a photos.asurion.com, and then we want my.asurion.com/photos, we could actually deploy both of them from the same code base with two different Webpack configurations, one of which that would include the index HTML. So we could onboard them very, very quickly and then start to look at how do we integrate the experiences from there. In the case of the Webpack module federation, and I know about this much about it, but from what I saw, there was some modifications I saw that I wanted to explore a little bit more as to how we reference packages within, and I could be completely off. So the easy answer is no, not a lot of experience with that, but I think it's really promising, and I think it's definitely worth exploring.
I was going to jump in real quick too, Neil, if you don't mind. One thing that you kind of hit the nail on the head when we were looking at kind of our existing infrastructure for our development pipelines. A lot of our apps were built with Create React app, and a lot of those were using older versions of Webpack. So we were on Webpack 4. So we weren't quite ready to upgrade to Webpack 5, and all the dependency chain needed to facilitate that. So the single spa approach enabled us to quickly, like you said, get those teams up and running very quickly, and especially with the helper library you mentioned, took that configuration down to a couple lines of code you drop in and off you go. I think Zoltan in the chat mentioned, asked the question. Single Spa has mentioned in their documentation that, hey, this is not mutually exclusive. It's something you can use now. You could do the import maps, or you could use module federation. You probably shouldn't do both. I have a hunch or a feeling as module federation matures that Single Spa will probably go that direction. And one of the cool things with adopting Single Spa is we kind of get that out of the box once they get to that point. The API surface area shouldn't change, like mounting and unmounting applications, parcels, and so forth should stay similar, hopefully, and then we just be able to take advantage of it. So this seems like a in quotes, kind of a future-proof way to kind of like you said, strangle out these applications into their own micro experiences.
Yeah, it's a totally good point, right? Like, and it actually makes me think of something else that I think is pretty key here, right? So, under the hood, one of the things you should know about SingleSpot is we're making use of System.js under the hood, right? Like for the dynamic imports. With Webpack Module Federation, that'll end up, I think, sort of doing that replacement, which is great. But you really bring forward in my head, one of the most key things here is we wanted it to be as painless as possible when we onboarded the teams. Like, and literally saying to them, as is, where is, like, just take and bundle this way, and we can put you on. Excuse me one sec. And so I think that made a big difference for us for Webpack. So some examples. Basically, what we told our teams is like, look, when they say, well, do we have to use your analytics right away, or do we have to use this or that library right away? And our answer was always, look, as long as you don't impact other teams, we sort of don't care. And what ends up happening is, so I'll take as an example React. The React library. If I have 10 different, MXs, it's going to be a pretty crummy experience if every time a mobile user goes from, claims to photos to whatever, that they're reloading the entirety of the React application, right? Or they're reloading the entirety of our UI, or reloading the entirety of take your pick of shared libraries. So basically what you do in Webpack is you do exports, or exclusions rather. You're going to exclude that library from your bundle, which is going to make your bundle smaller. And then that bundle for React, for example, will take and get loaded, mounted as a utility module in the top. And that actually is a good segue to the last one. I mentioned parcels. The fourth one is utility modules. So utility modules, in-browser modules that generally have their own repository and CI process. They export a public interface of functions and variables that any app can import and use. And so if we go back to sort of this architecture, again, we've got the app root, which has an import map. We have the MXs themselves. We have a set of utility modules. And then we also publish, which I don't think is really represented on this particular screen, we have parcels. So for example, the dashboard is composed of a set of parcels that all get built in real time. But sort of the magic of this is, like, dashboard can be hosted and served from, CloudFront with S3, but claims, if they so chose, could be served by Kubernetes and Akamai if they wanted to, CDN wise, in terms of this bundle, or we can proxy it and use a single CDN if we want. But each one of these stacks is completely independent, and each one of these teams gets to choose exactly how they want to build and deploy. They can have completely different pipelines. They can have different deployment schedules. So examples would be, when you're talking about claims or some others, like, there are very stringent requirements in terms of how of the types of checks that you do and the approvals you go through, et cetera. But maybe there's another MX that's much lower impact that doesn't necessarily have the same requirements or needs. Well, in this way, you can allow each team to have its own deployment process, its own release cycle, its own coding standards, et cetera, and they can work across. Now, I'm not saying that it's just the Wild West and let anybody do anything in any place, right? Like, that's really hard to sort of scale as an organization or a company. But what we try to do is we try to work by convention, instead of like sort of by like hardcore, this is the standard, you cannot deviate, thou shalt use, curly braces, on the next line on an if statement or some silly thing. Like, each team can have some standards that they want. What we do is we create reference implementations of what does an MX look like? What does a pipeline look like that will automatically deploy on merge to main and all of the required checks going through? What are the best practices? We'll do by reference to help those teams out, but every team still gets to do the things they need to do to be successful. And that's how we keep them innovating. Hopefully that's helpful. I hope I'm explaining that. Okay. And so just moving forward a little bit, if you look at like, what does the developer experience look like? And I'm going to show you a quick video of this to show what this kind of looks like. I'm a new developer. I just joined the photos team, right? The first thing that I do from a developer experience point of view is I'm going to go browse our stable version of our application. Okay. So literally, I don't even have my code editor open. I just go to my browser and I pull up the stable app and I look at it and I say, okay, now I'm going to clone the photos repo. So I go to the repo, I clone it, I bring it to my local machine. I'm going to yarn install and yarn start it. And I should point out, I don't have to yarn install. I could npm install if my team preferred that, but I'm going to yarn install and I'm going to yarn start. And when I do that, it's going to load up a local development server of only the Photos MX. So everything else is running from the stable. Then I'm going to override the path in the browser. So you're going to see that there's a browser extension that's included with SingleSpot that allows you to override if we already had photos in there being loaded from the stable environment. I'm going to override that definition and say, pull this from my local machine instead. Then I'm going to develop. I'm going to make changes to that app. I'm going to review those local changes embedded in the stable app, which is actually super cool because I'm able to, it's effectively an integration test. Like I can see the latest stable environment all the time and know that my thing will work within it. So I'm going to review those changes and then I'm going to push my application code. And then from there, we go on with the rest of the process, right? I push my application code to the repo. I create a pull request. The pull request is going to go through a series of, within my pipeline, it's going to do my linting and my unit tests, my functional and integration tests, and on and on. And it's going to have a pull request review and my other developers will review it. And then when they all approve it, I merge to main. When I merge to main, it deploys. And then when it deploys, it's out there in production the same way that I saw it exactly here. So I'm going to show a video of that really quick here. Let's get it going. And I'll point out before I get this thing started. So this particular site, and you can go there, react.microfrontends.app. This was developed, I believe, by the SingleSpot project. So this is nothing that I did, but I show it because I think it's such a cool example. And you're going to see here, there's a people and a planet. So it's a sample app all built in React. There's an app root. There are two different, what I call MXs, two different micro front ends, people and planets. And you'll see this button that's down in the bottom right here. And that's the override button in development environments alone. And I know sometimes people go, oh, wait, what about production? Is that going to be a problem? No, it's super simple that basically by configuration, you just say this is production and that doesn't exist and you can't override it in the same way. So what's going to happen here is I'm going to show you planets. I'm going to override the planets package and download, and then I'm going to change a little bit of text. So let's give this guy a go. So this is me, developer. I look, there's Tatooine, and I can see the code. So now I'm going to go and clone the repo. So I'm going to pull this planets repo. And again, you can do this just the same as I did. So I go to my edit, go to my terminal and clone that particular library and pull it down. Then I'm going to go into the planets directory, of course, and yarn install it. And it's not so silent. It's going to take a second. I actually didn't shorten the video as I went here. But basically what it's doing is just pulling down just the same way as if I was doing the Photos app and pulling it within. Once I get done with this, I'm going to yarn install it and yarn start it. And I'm going to change a button out that goes within. So we'll give it just a sec. And so when I do this yarn start, you're going to see I put it on HTTPS and port 9001. Webpack, you may not know, has the ability to run on HTTPS, and we'll do a temporary certificate for you. And because the entire app is done in HTTPS, that helps. So now I'm going to hit the button in the bottom right because I'm running locally. And this is the list of all the MX libraries that are there. So this is everything that's integrated with that import map. And I'm going to click on one. And one of the nice parts is you're going to see I do 9001 and it automatically assumes that it's localhost. And I refresh, I go to planets, same app, but now it's running locally instead of from that remote server that they have. And just to prove it, I'll go in to this planets page, which is what you're seeing there, and I'm going to change the button on it to fetch even more planets. And by the time I save and go back, you can see the button already changed. So that's a pretty cool developer experience. Like, I'm able to get up and running right out of the gate just by pulling down, cloning the repo. And I think that the key aspect here, and I've worked in organizations with the 80 teams that are all working on a single app. The cool thing about this is we always struggled when I was with that org, and even within this, is how do I have a federated application where I don't have to download and install everybody's stuff? Like, I don't want it. And it's funny because I've got a book club that I started within Ashurian that we're reading the Unicorn Project right now. And if you've ever read it, it's an awesome book. But sort of several chapters of that is the sort of protagonist trying to just get a build going. I think in a federated application, it gets really, really hard. Single SPA helped us to do this out of the box. And I'm not a sales guy because it's open source anyway, but it helped us to do it out of the box in such a way that we could go going super fast. And I think that's a real benefit to know about. So just a couple other things I'll just mention in terms of how we did this in terms of our project and how you might consider it for your own organization. So it's one thing to say, hey, we're going to do this micro front end. It's another thing to sort of figure out how to take a company that's been ingrained in a certain path and switch them out. Before I go through and mention this, I'm going to say a couple things about, like, the big question I get asked all the time is, like, when is it, and this is going to be my opinions entirely, what is a good use case for micro front ends, and what is not as good a use case? I would argue that if I work in a tech startup that has single product, and I'm going to say certainly less than 10 teams, maybe less than 5 teams, I think micro front ends, there's complexity. There's complexity to it in getting it set up and to compose and to be able to debug, et cetera. I think if you're less than 5 teams, if you're 2 teams and you're trying to get that thing going, I think micro front ends is not necessarily the way to go. I think once you get north of 10 teams and you're getting to 15 to 20 to 30 to whatever, I think micro front ends make a ton of sense, because now you're getting into this level of where we want to sort of, I don't want to say silo the work, but we want single responsibility for teams. We want them to own a domain and build and deploy ongoing. And so I really think, like, if you're less than 5 teams, I'd be cautious. The good news is, so I'm a tech startup. We have a great idea. We're going to start building a React app. We start building the React app. And then we get to a point where it's like, okay, we went from 1 team to 3 teams to, man, we got funded and we're 10 teams and we keep going. You can always switch to this. You can, as a matter of fact, that's what we did. We had a pre-existing React app that started as our first application we were going to quote unquote on board, and they actually owned the domain name we needed. And so what did we do? We shimmed in single SPA and said, just send all traffic to that app. And so we took a React app, we shimmed in single SPA, and so it took over the index HTML, and then off we went, and we started adding additional apps with additional routes. So you can switch at any time. So I think that's a pretty key point. But assuming you're going to go down this path, and assuming you have an organization of some scale, right? Like, and I think every organization has its own challenges. 3 things that we really put in place that we felt really good about. One is that we put a platform steering committee in place. And so we didn't go at it as a top-down, hey, let's go build this thing. Let's go put in micro front ends. We're going to be the arbiters of all things micro front ends. We're the platform team, and we're going to tell you how you're going to run your app. We meet every single week. We do a 30-minute lean coffee meeting where any MX team can join. and they come in and we have conversations to figure out exactly how we're going to build this thing out and how all the moving pieces will work. Within that, and we get pretty good attendance every single week. We also rotate who's running the meeting, so it's not just the platform team. And that's been successful. Technically, every team gets a vote. We've never actually had a vote. I think sometimes, it's been great. I mean, Asurion, folks are able to make decisions and work together in a way that's super supportive of one another. I've worked in organizations before where you sort of come into a meeting loaded for bear to justify and back up any assertion that you make or any idea you have. And we just don't have that at Asurion. But I will say for organizations that sort of have that circumstance, just by virtue of the teams having that vote, sometimes help people to figure out how to problem solve instead of how to figure out what might go wrong. So just a suggestion, platform steering committee that engages everybody. The second is the platform enablement team itself. And so we have a team of engineers, designers, as well as we have a delivery lead, et cetera, that we combined. Basically what we did is compose this team from developers that were matrixed to us from different parts of the company to bring them together so that we had ties back to all the different teams and locations of the MXs. That team has basically a couple of responsibilities. One, we care and feed the app root. We do, and we have the institutional knowledge to know how to, will this PR that adds this particular MX break everybody else? We take care and make sure the monitoring's in place and we do all of the reference, I shouldn't say that. We did the first reference implementations. We strongly encourage sort of an inner source model. And now we actually have other teams that are starting to contribute their own reference implementations of different capabilities. Third, we tend to be the folks that do the first go at the utility modules. And so we've done 6 or 7 so far for the different teams. Everything from analytics to authentication to styling, et cetera. But we've also had 2 teams that have also contributed utility modules in as well, because they had a need and we just didn't have space. And then the third is MX teams. They are, it's not like a fee for service thing where it's like, oh, we're this group that came up with a platform and now, it's almost like you're customers of ours. Like we treat the MXs like customers to the extent of we're very quick to help and serve them, but we really engage them as partners. And so like, for example, in the onboarding, every team we call them one service evangelists, but basically we have engineers on the platform team that get assigned to say, okay, you're going to go work with this team. Any questions they have, they can ask you first and then the team at large, but you get sort of this interactive collective there. I think there was another question from the chat, which is, what if you're one team, but your UI is just too big with tons of bad practices? I think so. Let's assume that the UI is really big and it actually doesn't have to be a single page app. If it's that big and you're at the moment where it's like, we need to switch to something else, or we want to start to make this better, it's a really good question. I think that actually could be a really good opportunity for a micro front end or micro experience approach. And I'll tell you why. You can take, effectively it's a monolithic UI, right? You take the monolithic UI, you, as I would say, shim it with single spa. So basically you put a single spa app root in with one micro experience, one MX, which is the big Megillah, the big thing, right? And basically all traffic's going to go to that. And then you say, okay, let's take one feature of that and let's create it as an MX. And so we're going to take that feature and we're going to start to strangle it off from the big feature, and we're going to just put it on a separate route. That's one way you absolutely could do it, and you can run both in production. If you read some of the literature with single spa, the reason it even exists, I think, was they were going, and I experienced this at a previous company, they were going from Angular 1 to Angular next, like Angular 2 plus kind of thing. And they just couldn't get across because it was so radically different. They couldn't get across the line. I think they may have switched it to React. I'm not sure on that story, but the truth is you could do any of that. Like they built it because they couldn't seem to get off of, it was an easier way to get off Angular or Angular 1. So what you could do is you could say, oh, we're going to take, awful monolith and we're going to build a new app. And even if it's going to be a monolith again, you could actually have them both coexist at the same time. It gets a little bit ugly in terms of how much JavaScript you're loading, but it is definitely a path for migration. Big monolith, take one experience at a time, or big monolith, build new big monolith, but the right way. And we're just going to route between them. And that way you can have the same domain, go to the same app. And it gives it a little bit cleaner connection between the two. So if there's, within the memory space, one of the things you can't, and I should step back and take a breath too. Shared state is something that you just got to be cautious about, right? Like we have autonomous teams. The surest way to break autonomy or to ruin autonomy is let's couple them all in some shared state tree, because now we're all dependent on it. And so what we try to do is keep absolutely ruthlessly minimal that state tree of any type of state that they might share to things that they actually have to share. But it is one way that if you had session state or you had any sort of, a Redux tree or something, in theory, those two apps could both make use of something like a shared state piece, and that would help you to migrate. Hopefully that answered that question. Trying to think of other gotchas that we ran into. One of the big ones that came up was we actually had a JavaScript library for a video streaming provider. It was a proprietary library that was ill-behaved. And I can't remember if it was AMD or UMD, but at any rate, it was ill-behaved. And we were able to work around it, but ultimately we had to go back to the vendor and say, hey, I don't think your library is behaving the way that maybe it should, or maybe we're doing something wrong. Can we work together to get this modified? And they actually did it. They made some modifications and fixed it for us. That I think is the only major issue we've run into in terms of incompatibilities, where it was like, ooh, this isn't going to work. The other one that we played around a bit with, and I wasn't directly involved on the engineering side, was service workers was a little bit of a challenge with the way we were doing proxying. But we were able to work around that too. Other than that, we haven't run into any substantial showstoppers. And I would say the crazy thing about this, and Will tell you, basically they grouped, in the midst of COVID, they grouped like 18 engineers together and said, you have 2 weeks to figure out a path that we might consider going on together. And on day one, it was like deer in the headlight. And I don't know, maybe it's just me. Like, you put 18 senior engineers in a room and you say, hey, you guys all agree on something. That can be a hard thing to do.
Yeah.
Right. But it turned out like within a few days, like we went through, this got proposed, everybody dug in on it. And literally within 2 weeks, we come to a point where it was like, all right, now we just need to figure out strategically, like, let's do a proof of concept. Let's take it down this path. And it's just continued to pay dividends, which has been nice. So yeah, and I think it's based on that autonomy, that it still gives some freedom to some folks within. So at any rate, platform steering committee, platform enablement team, and then MX teams are all sort of teams for this success within. So I think with that, that's pretty much all I had. I don't know if there's additional questions or other thoughts.
I haven't seen anything else come through the chat, but if y'all have any other questions, feel free to ask. We can hang back for a couple more minutes and get them answered for you. While we're waiting, Neil, one thing that might be worth sharing is that import map service that we were looking at. We ended up not using it,
Yep.
but it could be helpful for teams getting spun up for helping manage their imports, import maps.
Yeah, for sure. Do you want to? I think you looked at it as much or more than I did. Do you want to talk to that for a sec?
Yeah, sure. Let me see if I could find the name of it real quick. 1 second.
Yeah. While you're looking it up, I'll just give a sort of the highest level overview I can think of, which is, in our case, we do import maps as sort of a static JSON file. So what is an import map? It's effectively like a JSON file that defines the imports you're doing dynamically. And the idea is like, well, okay, what we're doing is doing it statically because we want to make sure it goes through pull requests, pull request reviews, etc. I don't know that we need to, and it's been created some interesting questions. So yeah, Will, do you want to jump on that?
I was gonna say, I shot you a link on the chat if you want to just pull up that and share
Sure.
real quick. But yeah, basically the idea is somewhere within your CI pipeline, as teams are releasing MX changes, you can basically dynamically hydrate your import map. So you can think of like canary deployments or blue-green deployments. You actually could like have different endpoints service your application and notify this import map service to be able to say, hey, my service is actually located here now, or this is the version that I want you to serve. So you could do quick rollbacks. You could do quick failovers, and like I said, blue-green type things or canary deployments, things like that. But this basically, you would basically do a curl request. That's hard to say. From your CI and say, hey, here's my new deployment. You could use hashes in the URL or whatever to version it. But it basically would make it where you could use this import map and the file that's served from that service as your import map on your root app, and quickly be able to manage that. Especially we're talking 85 teams, that could be making and managing that could be overwhelming. But the tighter control that we landed on with the PR process seems to work for us too. So.
Yeah. The other thing that we did come up with was a way in non-prod environments, so sort of secured environments, where we could pass in a URL param, a query param, that allowed us to like in a CI process, take and override a specific package in terms of and ensuring the security of it and making sure it was protected, but giving a way to do very similar to this deployer. And we use it in very, very limited circumstances. But I think that helped as well.
Awesome. I was gonna say, we haven't open sourced that helper library yet for the Create React app stuff, but yeah. I can see what it would take to get it polished up and reusable outside of our org. If anyone's interested, shoot me a note and I'll see if I can get that released up on our open source org on GitHub. And it should just be 2 or 3 lines on your existing config to get it up and running. So, and then really just building out a root app, which I think there's even like a create, what's it called? Create single spa. I think there's a helper CLI where you can actually just generate a root app. And it has all the stuff baked in for you, and you can just plug in your experiences into the import map after that. It's pretty straightforward. Yeah. I did a single spa intro talk a couple months back. I don't remember how good it is or how thorough it was, but you might want to visit that as well if you're interested in this. And obviously reach out to Neil on Twitter or hit us up on NashDev, and would love to help any way we can. So let's see. Oh, sorry, one last question. Can you summarize why microfrontends are so great for scalability? Keeping the root app small, managing packages, autonomous teams.
Oh, interesting. Why is it so great for scalability? I think it's a matter of scaling organizations, right? Like, so in terms of the application itself, it adds complexity. If you have a single team and you're trying to scale your app using a few teams or whatever, it can be a little bit challenging. I think when you have a distributed team, like it's about scaling the organization, scaling the teams themselves. I think the other thing that you can think of is it's been interesting talking about like performance testing, right? Like performance testing ends up happening all in the browser, it actually allows you to effectively scale infrastructure, right? So if each MX package is coming from a different location, it creates challenges, which is, and we spend a lot of time sort of operational monitoring of ensuring like, hey, let's be certain we have the availability of each one of these packages. But what's been kind of cool is like, if one of the particular MX or, MX or parcels or whatever becomes unavailable, the rest of the app runs. Like there's a level of resiliency that goes with it as well. I think
It's
the
like
other
a
thing,
graceful degradation. You could like fill in that spot if that parcel or whatever doesn't load correctly, or
it's kind of like the internet itself, right? Like if particular nodes disappear, you can continue on. So the resiliency of it, I think, is pretty significant. I think the other piece to it is, at least in our case, if we were going to run 10 different apps and we were just going to link between them, and there was some discussion of that, like, well, let's just make it easy, and we're going to link between them. They'll all be branded the same. We'll have shared design library, and so aside from the URL bar, the consumer can't tell. The truth is like, well, then you're reloading every library across the wire every time. And oh, by the way, those are bundled in Webpack into single bundles or at best chunks. So I think from a performance point of view, you go up as well.
Yeah, that's a great point, Neil. When I was at Lonely Planet, that was one of the approaches we took before we did one of our big refactorings to be more of a single page approach. But we built these actual microservices that would serve UI for header and footer, like this shared commonality and analytics and all that stuff. And it worked well until we wanted to make an update to the navigation, and then we had to deploy 25 servers because we had to bump the package. Like it's a pain in the butt.
Right.
That didn't happen often, but it was enough to really, this is not feeling so great. But we eventually moved to more of a mono repo approach. Or I guess monolithic UI approach using React as a single page app, namely because the product we were building was mostly uniform, and a lot of the business domains weren't specialized in the sense, but it very well could have been a good fit for single spa in the sense that we had was like 6 or 7 teams kind of building against the same product. So it would have been cool to have each team own their own areas and have parcels to be able to drop in places. One other question in the chat. Let's see. Is micro-frontend architecture compatible with server-side rendering frameworks such as NextJS?
I haven't looked specifically at NextJS, but it's definitely compatible with server-side rendering. That's sort of the next phase for us that we're going to take a look at. And actually, what'll be interesting about it is looking at server-side rendered parts of the app, right? Mm-hmm. So, for example, if we're using a content management system for articles and things like that stuff doesn't have to be re-rendered. Could we take and server-side render just one portion of the application, et cetera? Yeah. But single spa absolutely supports it, and there is documentation. If you go to that, it's single-spa.js.org, and we can follow up with that link.
Yeah, I posted a link in the chat if you're interested. There's a link there to that SSR documentation.
Oh, beauty. Yeah.
It would be really great though, like if something like Next.js, for example, where you could SSR an experience or even statically render it, right? Have it in memory on the server or even baked out to an HTML file somewhere. That could really improve your performance, especially if it doesn't need to be real-time dynamic.
I thought that they had where you could even just, you didn't even need a single page app. Maybe I'm misremembering this, but I thought that they could actually do static HTML, like HTML and web components. Yeah. So I'll take this 2 seconds. Let me share this screen. So this is the documentation for single spa. There we go. And so within the documentation for single spa, they have a section down here called ecosystem, and within ecosystem, it'll show all the different single page apps or frameworks, if you will, that it supports. So React, obviously, towards the top. Vue, love. HTML web components down here. Helper library implementing raw HTML and web components, single spa applications or parcels. So I think this is an interesting thing to take a look at. the one thing that it does, this sort of leaked globals, it also has this thing. So like, let's say that you have some misbehaving app, or I shouldn't say misbehaving. You have some apps that were built without thinking about the fact that they could someday be in the same memory space as other apps, right? Like it's my website. I built a React app and I just assumed I could use a global on the window object. This single spot leaked variables library, it'll remove specific global variables from window during your application's unmount lifecycle, add them back during the mount lifecycle, which is kind of cool because it sort of helps you to solve some issues that people have run into in the past.
That's really cool. Speaking of the server-side rendering piece, if you've seen, I think Rails just introduced that. Was it called Hotwire? I can't remember the name of the tech that they have. But basically, they're sending HTML over the wire now, right? It's fully rendered HTML that just splats to the page. So something similar to that. If you could imagine your microfrontends doing an SSR, they're delivering a full HTML payload that could then be hydrated for client-side navigation. So that could be really, really compelling. I mentioned in the chat. Kind of one of the reasons we haven't really wholeheartedly investigated SSR yet is because most of our experiences are kind of gated behind login, right? We don't need the Google juice that you get from SSR so much. Obviously, there's performance benefits to SSR as well, but one of the big benefits though is the discoverability that SSR gives you on SERPs. But I am a huge fan of NashJS. So if we can figure out a way to get NashJS up and running on this thing, it'd be really cool because their whole ecosystem for building apps is just really cool. With their API their routers and their image utilities, all that stuff. I mean, it's just freaking awesome. So I could gush about NextJS all day long.
Yeah, that's great. Well, and I think that. So I agree. I also, it occurs to me, like you mentioned about like in the Rails world, where I guess it's Hotwire. I mean, Rails has been doing, and it used to be sort of this weird, icky word you didn't like to say a lot, but turbolinks was something in Rails a long time ago where, effectively they were pre-rendering pages and sort of taking a lot of the pain that people were experiencing about like page loads that they could basically render within the same window using turbolinks, using Rails. A lot of the same stuff that we try to do in single page apps in the front end. And not to say that React isn't awesome, it is. But I think there's a lot that could be learned between the communities, right? Like there's some stuff that they've really figured out in terms of server-side rendering that I think if you could combine that, Next.js, and single spot, I think you're really doing well.
Yeah, I think Turbolinks was kind of an evolution, or sorry, Hotwire is like an evolution of Turbolinks. Same idea, but it's a different implementation. So let's see. I think that's it on the questions. But yeah, so Neil, thank you so much for sharing. This was awesome.
Cool.
I always get excited when I get to chat with you about this stuff because it's just such a cool time to be at Asurion and working on this stuff. So I should plug that if you are interested in joining Asurion, we have tons of roles for full stack engineers, data scientists. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff. So if you're interested, go to careers.asurion.com and check out something that could be a good fit for you. And if this kind of stuff excites you, you could do it daily. So check it out.
Absolutely, come hang out.
And cool. So we'll go ahead and wrap it up here. I would like to say, if you, like I said before in the beginning of the stream, if you have a talk that you're interested in giving, it could be anything, really, anything JavaScript to JSON or web development. It could be soft skills. It could be anything. We're always looking for something cool to share. So just go to nashjs.org, hit the form at the top of the page, and send us a submission, and we'll get you on the schedule. And Neil, thank you so much. Appreciate your time. And thanks, everybody, for tuning in. And appreciate all y'all's support. And we'll see you next month.